Сегодня у нас 3 гостя. Брюс Kuwabara, Dendra и Thomas Auer, которые на примере своих проектов расскажут о том, как возможно поменять город, о том, как возможно одним проектом что-то кардинально изменить, а потом последует дискуссия, в которой они на эту же тему поразмышляют все вместе. И приглашаю сейчас Брюса представить свой проект.
No, that's good. So thank you very much. We are really delighted to be here tonight, and thank you very much for coming. It's a little cold tonight, but I think the discussion will warm us up. I'm really, my name is Thomas Auer. I'm with Transsolar, an engineering firm from Germany and Paris and New York, and we are doing sustainable design, and we were involved in both projects. So because we think that in this topic of how can one building make a change in a city, sustainability is one of the drivers. So, but we're going to hear more about this. We're really glad to have Bruce and Daniel here today. Bruce came from Toronto. He's with KPMB Architects, an award-winning firm from Toronto. Bruce last year got the honor of Canada. So the Queen came to honor him. So there you see how important the firm is in Canada. So we are happy to have you here and looking forward to your talk. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Thomas. Now, I come from Canada, so I'm very used to this weather, but I've never lectured outside with a coat on. But I wanted to focus on some projects that we've done recently, and particularly in terms of how they relate to making a city. And for me, the talk is not just that one building can make a big difference, but it's really a series of themes that have been developed in the work over a number of years. A lot of the projects share a lot in common, but I've kind of tried to pull them out, and I'll present them relative to some very simple themes, because I want to introduce you to the kind of issues of urbanism that are developed in North America. So the first slide is really, benchmark work by Jane Jacobs, who lived in Toronto, where I'm from. And she really lived in New York and really talked about very simple aspects of urban life. She was not a planner, she was an ordinary citizen. And it's a controversial book because there's a critique, a backlash against it. But if you actually read it, you actually see how she is very interested in very simple things. One is diversity. Second is walkability. Third is an incorporation of heritage buildings and history, that you can't just demolish everything and just start again. And so it was about incremental growth, incremental change. The book on the right is Richard Florida's book, and he's teaching at the business school we did in Toronto. And he was looking at the census and the population and the attractors to major cities, the things that people who are working in creative fields are looking for. And he talked about the analysis of cities on 3 indices: talent, technology, and tolerance. Tolerance being very important today. And then a friend of mine, Stephen Marsh, try to Google this one. This is a very good article. It was on, "Is Facebook Making Us Lonely?" And to that I would say that we've been working for a very large management firm, Deloitte. They're the largest management company in the world, 165,000 employees worldwide. And they did a survey of all of their staff, the people who were in their 20s, the 30s, 40s, 50s, and so on. And they found that the question was bricks or clicks. And they were trying to decide whether they'd build a new university for Deloitte. And they were surprised that the people who are in their 20s were the group that most placed the highest value on face-to-face, real-time interaction. It was interesting. So here are the themes. The first one is having the confidence to believe that the public realm is important. It's something that you need to construct. I think it's the project of our time, to actually believe that you can build a public realm and that you need to believe in it in order to design it. The first project is in the suburbs. And it is of Toronto. You're seeing Toronto, and you see the problem in North America, which is suburban development, high growth, sprawl, very low density, terrible public transportation. This was a competition that I told our team, it's not necessary that we would win this competition. There were existing buildings on the site. This is showing our first phase, but the competition was for 27 acres in a vast suburban field, and that these buildings would come down, the existing city hall from the 1980s, which was a terrible building, and a senior citizens home that gets replaced on the site. What you see is the division of land, some of the best agricultural land in the province of Ontario, and we were fascinated with the horizontal pattern of land subdivision because all of these roads lead to the lake. And it's a beautiful pattern. It's about intensive use, very intentional use of the ground. But the reality of that context is that it's suburban like any other North American suburb, except they had double-digit growth. The land is inspirational. These were our concept sketches for the competition. We broke two of the rules. One was they wanted all surface parking, and we said absolutely not. And the second one was they wanted really one building. If you read the competition brief, they wanted one building for the city hall and the library and suburban parking all around. And we said, no, what we will do is the opposite. We will put parking below, and we will actually make a figure of public space where no one would expect it. And so this is our site plan. You can see the buildings that are demolished and the first phase that is built. We made a campus, an urban campus where you park and then walk. And you may actually rethink your relationship to the land. This was from the competition. I have a short film. We have a series of short films on the building. It was just opened recently. This is made by Maris Mazoulis, who used to work for Bruce Mao. You should know Bruce Mao. He's from Toronto. But this building was really about having the confidence to create a space that would be a public space in the suburbs and actually produce something that is not there and that is so much of a contrast. Most of our projects, as you'll see, actually respond to what's there. In this case, we said, we can't respond to what's there. It's just nothing to respond to. And we're very interested, as you can see, I think in European modernism and architecture that is quite global, but it is also local in the sense that Canada has a very, very open, very accessible democracy. I think it's an interesting model to look at in terms of its concepts of plurality and governance. Canada is the last country in the world that accepts people from all over the world. We have a very open immigration policy, so I would invite any of you to come. We also have very good hockey, but we'll see in the Olympics how good it is. This building is very, very sustainable. It's a municipal office, and we were trying to embed the building not only with a great sense of publicness, but also a great sense of design about the future, that the future would be truly sustainable, and the City Hall would be the model for the whole community. And the current master plan, which is constantly being reworked. But the whole idea is that right down the middle of the scheme is the council chamber. The water is sitting over the parking garage, and then there's a park and a garden and a theater and a library. Second theme is hybrids. This is a hybrid. Your school is fantastic. I've never seen a school with a restaurant on the roof that is featured in Travel and Leisure magazine. But I think it's an incredible social model, but it's an economic model. And so what I'm presenting is a hybrid, which is, we did the Toronto Film Festival. You know, my office is right here. But this is an incredible coming together of two elements. One is a residential market condominium tower, but the other is the home for the Toronto International Film Festival, which is on right now. And it's that combination between private and public goals that is really important for the future. The building that the Toronto International Film Festival occupies, they own 180,000 square feet. So 18,000 square meters. And the cinemas are all digital cinemas. The two upper floors are office spaces, and the ground floor and the second floor are very, very public. And we did the restaurant and the cafe. That's why I was looking at the restaurant here. The main entrance, it's all about how this building draws people to it, people who love film, but it's for education. The roof is a landscape, an urban landscape that looks back at the city of Toronto, and is where the condominium people, the residents, and the film-loving people come together. This is inside the building. It's a kind of atrium that links all of the cinemas. And then we have, too, a canteen on the ground floor, but it has a big cafe that opens up to the street. And it's very engaged. So the kind of architecture that I think makes a difference is architecture that engages you in the surroundings. It's not about the architecture as an object. It's about an architecture that is really open and connected. Vertical campuses. This is a great photograph by Thomas Struth, and German photographer, and he was shooting families, these portraits of families, and it was very inspirational to me. Richard Sennett, the cultural critic, wrote about this in one of his books, and it stopped me dead in my tracks, because he said that these people were like buildings on a public space, and the table was the public space. And I thought, wow, that's incredible, because they're short and tall, men and women, young and old. And so when we got to do the ballet school, this is Canada's National Ballet School. It had a series of heritage buildings, but it was a site that had both a public component and a private component where the towers are. So it's one of the most successful hybrid mixed-use developments in Toronto, because it's a mixture of private sector, market, residential, but also a national training center for the elite dancers. And so this incorporates an academic school program. There's a residence on another block. They had terrible facilities. These are very, very important heritage buildings, Georgian, Victorian. But we developed the dance studios, which all get light and alternate and become the mid-ground between the foreground, which is the heritage buildings, and the taller buildings, which are in the background, just like that family portrait. I said, perhaps the composition would really be like looking at a dance troupe on a stage. This is the town square behind that heritage Georgian building. All the classrooms are visible not only from the outside, but also from the inside. My daughter is dancing here now, that's where you really get the value of architecture. She's now dancing here. And it's very, very transparent because of the way we did the lighting, because we're facing east, and it stops traffic. And it's an icon, not because of the form, but because you know what's going on, because of the communication. That's where the iconography comes in, not through the architecture. It's both. Very important book for me, Opposable Mind, which is about integrative thinking, about how to step back and really look at the big picture before you actually make a decision. Many bad decisions are made very quickly. So this is a business school, the Rotman School in Toronto. The existing building is on the left. It's 15,000 square meters. And the new addition, which was a competition we won, was on the right. And we said, you've been very successful in a brick building. It's now time to extrovert the building, to really connect with the city, to really do something that builds on what you've achieved so far. So what we've done is we've created classrooms below. This is totally this vertical campus of having students at the ground floor, a very big event space. This takes 500 people with retractable seating, an incredible stair that integrates both the old and the new, and a series of roof terraces that create the campus at every level going up, much like this, except this is only 2 stories, but we're talking about up high and down low. It's another film. There's actually some sound here, but I'm afraid to touch this button. Can you take the volume up a bit? Bruce Mao did the branding for the school, and one of the colors was that pink. And so on the stair, which we think is the element which symbolizes the thinking in the school, we use that color inside. But because of this school and the way that we thought about it, we are now working at Princeton. We're doing economics at Princeton, and we're doing the Kellogg School at Northwestern. Canada's very cold, so we always have a fireplace in our buildings. That's the one thing that works. You get the feeling. It's really about a kind of idea of a city inside the building which allows people to converge and not have to leave the site in order to get outside. This is where Richard Florida's office is. We have an outdoor courtyard on the roof, but it has glass walls around it. Okay, transit-oriented development. I mean, the best alternative for cities is to connect to public transit and have alternative ways of moving around. We won a competition in Montreal, which is a great city, for 1 million square feet. So it's a huge development, but it's right on the major street in Montreal, which is St. Catherine Street. So this competition was done in 2000, and it's a visual arts school with Hexagram, which is their media center. It's below ground. It's the Faculty of Engineering, and it's the John Molson School of Business. And all of the buses that connect come in on this street, and we are plugged right into the subway. So this is all about how you make a building, an academic building in an urban context that allows people to connect to transit right through the university. And all of the interior spaces are really thought of as being outdoor spaces, just like this, except you're inside. And it's where students hang around. There are lots of places where people can meet. I think that's fundamental, that it's not just movement in transit-oriented development. I think you come to rest, and we're looking at all kinds of things like airport lounges. We're looking at places where people move. And we're bringing light to below. So this is another one of Morris's short films. I asked Morris to make a film not about our building, but about Montreal, and to allow our building to be a kind of backdrop, because I think that's what architecture has to be. It doesn't always have to be the icon. It can often be just the place where people like to hang around, like this place. I think this is a very good, you could say, is Strelka iconic? It doesn't matter to me. I think it's working for you right now. But we were very interested in the scale of a big, big building in a metropolitan city and the flow of people in and out of transit. Just a little more of this. You know, how do buildings actually behave in the flow of the city? I'm very interested in that, and how people who are not actually going into the building understand the environment of, say, Concordia. This is the public art. It was a competition on the glass. Then heritage, which was a key theme in Jane Jacobs' writings. This is Canada's first purpose-built museum, and it's a 20th century building, 1910. That's how young the building is. This is how the architect proposed it, but because of the soil conditions, the heavy stone began to sink into the ground. So they cut off the top of the tower, and they left it like that for 100 years. And this was a great tragedy, because the architect of this building was David Ewart, and he was Canada's first public works architect. So it was always a big tragedy in his career. So we called it the stump. But when we got this commission to make Canada's National Museum of Nature, only the lower floors, these ground and second floor, were accessible to the public. The stair system to the third and fourth was terrible, and it was for conservation and for administration. And we redid the whole building, the exterior, the interior. We dealt with seismic loading. We dealt with the interior control of temperature and humidity. But we radically changed the circulation to bring it up through the tower and to go back to the site where the stone was demolished and to create a glass tower that would crown David Ewart's base. And it's right on axis with our Parliament buildings. So this is it. It's an incredible feat of engineering because nothing in the glass touches anything in the stone. All of the foundations are well below. We could not bear on the stone at all. And it's very, very transparent. And you always move inside and outside of the building. You become very aware of the fabric of the heritage. I think that's how heritage should be appreciated, not like a postcard, but by being very close to the material. These are the scissor stairs, the stairs, the butterfly stairs, which frankly I saw in a Raphael Moneo building at Davis College, and I thought this is interesting. We can continue the circulation, but it's where young people love to be. They open up the museum to young people and try to really draw more people, but older people come as well. So I got very lucky, I guess. Maybe it was lucky, but you basically wait for 3 hours for 3 minutes with the Queen and the Prince. And then climate responsive architecture, Winnipeg, Moscow. Winnipeg is an extreme climate. And I worked with Thomas Auer on this. These are the facts. It's unbelievable. He said that they'd never seen anything that had that kind of delta or that kind of cold duration through the winter, but what it also has is abundant solar radiation and very strong south winds. Like, look at this windrows. It's all coming from the south. Thomas said it's like a coastal city. And look at the temperature gradient. You can see just how hot and how cold it gets. It gets hot and humid and cold and dry. Probably like here. These are the 3 models that were really crucial to the success of the project. Design is one element, but energy was really the target. We really wanted to reduce energy, and of course the business model. We had very simple goals, very clear, very simple goals, and the first goal is always to create a supportive, healthy workplace. You do not reduce energy just to reduce energy. You do it for a purpose, and the higher purpose is really to create a great working environment. Winnipeg, one of the great cities in the Midwest, but it is full of parking lots. It was once the gateway into the Arctic, and this street was one of the most famous streets. It's like St. Catherine Street, Portage Avenue. It's here, the blue line. You see the Red River, the Assiniboine River. Our site is right here, and it's a consolidation of Manitoba Hydro office space from 14 suburban locations into the downtown. It's bringing 2,000 people into the city. And our building is just another clue. This yellow line is due south, and it's on an angle to the grid because the grid of the city is shifting because everyone wants access to the river. So our building is really 2 buildings. It's 2 concrete loft buildings. We chose concrete for thermal mass, but also this particular configuration is almost like a capital letter A, where the outboard walls are column-free. They're clear spans from the core to the perimeter, and it creates a flat iron building, which is also very good because it minimizes solar impact on the street. The podium is used to adjust our building into the context of Portage, which is very low. It's high and low. And you enter the building here, but you can pass right through the building to Graham Street. Graham is actually where all the public transit is. All the buses come into that one corridor. And the city has, weather enclosed pedestrian bridges, which I really don't like, but it existed, and so we connect it and we bring people down to the ground where they belong. This is a diagram of how the building works. The key is we decoupled ventilation air from heating and cooling. We have radiant cooling and heating. We have the largest geothermal field in Canada. It's 280 holes down 120 meters. In winter, The building draws that south air in naturally. It's very passive. We're trying to reduce energy consumption, and it draws air into the raised floors. We have 100% raised floors, so we have displacement ventilation. This is all coming through Transsolar. We have a solar chimney on the north end on the main street, which is exhausting that air in the summer, and in the winter we take that air and we draw it down and we heat the parking. So we have 150 parking spaces for 2,000 people, which is unreal in North America. I mean, 150 spaces. And we made a park on the transit mall. So then the summer we just exhaust the air. It's very similar. And you'll notice that there's a blue waterfall feature, which is for humidification and dehumidification. An artist, Deco Dawson, is interesting. He's in Winnipeg, but he did this film using a thermographic camera. And we thought this was an interesting interpretation of a building that someone in Moscow might really appreciate. Just get into the building a little bit. The workers. He wanted people to sense the issues of heat, radiation, environment, surface. There's the main hall that goes through the whole block. The building on Portage, which has a podium base, and then the tower and the solar chimney. This is the passive preheating function. Sorry. The typical module is 6 stories, which for me is very important. It's a vertical campus of work with each neighborhood 6 stories, or 3 of them. The south atriums are the lungs of the building. The north atriums are only 3 stories, and they're very comfortable. The south get hotter. Obviously, in the summer, the solar chimney you can see, but all of the service elements are down the middle of the capital letter A, and all the space is clear. It's really, really good for planning and layout. The south atrium's very good for yoga. There's always an interconnecting stair, and at the far end you can see it where the bamboo is the humidification and dehumidification system. At the north end, it's very comfortable. People are looking down over the green roof. They're sitting beside the solar chimney, and they're looking down Portage. You know, we have the atriums, and we have a double wall of high-performance curtain wall, which has double glazing outside. Is probably what you'd have to do here, and single glazing inside. And we step the slab. This is a good detail. We step the slab to get more daylight penetration to the floor below. The ceiling is exposed concrete with radiant cooling and heating. The fresh air is coming in. It's all these blue arrows coming in. And in the summer, in good weather, we have windows that open. So this is the atrium with the dehumidification and humidification system. It's strands of mylar, which go 6 stories into a pool of water. When the air comes in, it comes in low. It comes in here under this bench. If it's really cold, it's preheated. It rises and stratifies. It contacts the ribbons and then enters the underfloor system into the space, comes up through displacement ventilation, hits bodies and computers, rises, and then is drawn to the north. This is just a wee bit on this facade. People stop on the sidewalks because you don't see this that often anywhere, actually, where the building starts to open up the facade. We have weather stations on the high roof and on the podium. And I notice they don't all open at the same time, but they do open. The solar chimney has a passive preheating function at the very top, where we have low iron glass, we have a steel frame, and we have black steel tubes with sand in it. And they just naturally heat up, get very hot, and start drawing the air up. It's a great kind of design. that's passive. This is the walkway through, which is very public. It's a lobby for 2,000 people, but it's also for community events. They have a Christmas market that is in here, and it gets lots of natural light. We recycled wood. We recycled 97% of the material of the buildings that were on the site. The park, it faces south. Thomas Auer said you need to build a canopy because of the downdrafts from the south wind. So we recycled the wood and the soffit. It's an organic market. These are the statistics, 2,000 people, but the real statistic is this, 67% energy savings, and this, which is really key, 86 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. These are just the reduction in sick days. They did a survey of 2,000 people, and after 3 years, they realized that people are sick less, 1.25 days per year, but it's over 2,000 people. This is the progressive reduction in energy because originally we didn't have the geothermal in place. It went in, and you see that energy going down, 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 down. This is when it opened. And then comparison to other buildings in Canada where we have a lot of energy consumptive buildings that are called green buildings, and our building is pretty much all by itself. This is our team. You need an integrated team. That's the lesson. You need, like your school, you need an integrative design thinking process. You need an integrated design team. You need everybody at the table. Do this briefly. We're doing the Pan American Games Athletes Village in an industrial area. We won a competition again, and it's for 8,000 athletes, and they're coming in 2015. This is the site right here. And we have many architects. I think this is a direction forward. I think it's been done in Europe, but not much in Canada. But with different architects doing different buildings, but within a family of forms. These are some heritage buildings that are reincorporated, a student residence. A lot of the athletes' accommodation will become condominiums. And the site plan was already given. And the competition was to design a coherent whole where diversity is in play. So this is our scheme. And then finally, these are the 7 strategies. So have confidence and just go and make the public realm. Just will the public realm into existence. Really think innovatively about hybrids. Think about organizing buildings that aren't just floor, 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 floor. Connect to transit, transform heritage, really reuse adaptively buildings that are even national treasures, respond to the climate maybe first, think about larger precincts before you think about your building. And finally, this is the end. We won this competition recently, and I wanted to show you because it puts together all of the themes, and it's for the new building for computational sciences at Boston University in Boston. It's on the Charles River, and BU, Boston University, does not have a good record for architecture, so our building is here. This is Commonwealth Avenue, which is Frederick Law Olmsted's contribution to the urbanism of Boston. It's a greenway system that connects parks. What Boston University said in the competition, which I thought was pretty incredible, is they've said computational sciences are central to all problem solving in all the other disciplines. And they're the first university client that actually said that. I think a lot of universities understand this, but it's not just math and engineering, it's social sciences and health, political science. And really what we proposed was something that looks like an architect's office. I mean, we use white glass on the core of the building, it's very open. It's not that special, Your studios are very basic. They're like this building. It's just very open. What's really important is how the studios are connected to the public domain. That's what makes this successful. It's not your studios. It's this idea, which is bigger than a studio. They love this. They're baseball fans, so we see our building. And now we have to go before the Boston Redevelopment Authority. Boston is a very conservative city, but we're using terracotta louvers, which frankly Thomas proposed on the angle. That's what you have to do to win the competition. It's the video. We only presented the video. So when we finally got in front of the selection committee, we only presented the video. That was it. We didn't even present drawings or panels. So that's it. Thank you very much. I've run over a bit, but thank you very, very much.
One, two, yeah. Bruce, thank you. This was great, and I think we do question and answer. We do later as part of the discussion, and hand it over to Daniel. Just one comment on Manitoba Hydro. I had been to Winnipeg last year, and there's really a change going on in the city. It was a city with a dying core, and it was the mayor of Winnipeg who forced Manitoba Hydro to put this building downtown. They didn't put in a staff cafeteria in this building, so all the employees have to go outside into the city. So it's 2,000 people who really interact with the city, and Bruce showed that 70% is using public transportation. And it really made a change in the city. Now, compared to Moscow, it's a fairly smaller city, but what we learned is, we call this a second-tier city. What we learned is that there are more people on this planet living in second-tier cities than in the Moscows, Londons, and Paris of this world. So to this regard, I think it's also very interesting what Daniel is doing in Sadka, which is also a second-tier city, even a little smaller than Winnipeg. So Daniel.
Thank you. I'm just another architect, so I never had the pleasure to meet the Queen, but we're doing now the competition here for the Zaradia Park, so maybe we meet Putin one day when we win. That's maybe the Russian equivalent to the Queen. And the practice that I'm leading, another architect, so we are really interested in stuff like this. So it's like integrated systems, where if we think about urban design or architecture, we think how to reuse energy, reuse water, and but not in order or mainly to save energy, but to like increase the comfort of people. So in our projects we try always that the kind of like person, the user, is always the center of the development. And so our idea is also a bit what we're trying to bring into the design is that we don't want to have this kind of like top-down system, not designing for people, but actually designing with people together. And that what we're trying to bring into every project, like some participation process. And so for today, because Bruce was showing the Manitoba Hydro building, and you will see later the building that I'm showing, there's obviously some connections also through Thomas kind of being part of both of the teams. And I wanted to open up the topic for the discussion a bit, talking about how actually buildings can change people, can change cities, by looking into workplaces. And I think kind of work is a very important part of our life. And actually, that's not a workplace, that's a university, but that is like how work looked before. It was kind of like a symbol, kind of like buildings were like showing the power of companies. And in the recent years, like with new technologies, changed to something like this. So like workplaces became like kind of a mosaic, like a bazaar almost. Like Bruce was already pointing that out, that like, you know, like this is kind of a hybrid. So like in New York you have the coffees places, like coffee places that actually act like office places where people go and work. And this is what you see here at daytime as well, at the Strelka bar, that there's a lot of people just coming here for working with their laptops. It actually doesn't matter anymore where you are. So this is really the kind of, I would say, yesterday. So it's a big company, Chrysler. They built kind of this tower in New York to really show their power, show how mighty they are. And this is two of the biggest office developments that are going to be constructed at the moment. The one on the top is the Facebook headquarters by Frank Gehry, and on the bottom is the Apple headquarters by Foster. And what is the main difference between these two buildings and what you saw before? These buildings almost want to disappear. So if you think of these two companies as being amongst one of the mighty companies in the world because they have access to a lot of data and can access a lot of our data, they kind of like don't want to demonstrate their power, but it's very interesting that their buildings almost become like park buildings. They disappear in the park. So the Apple one is placed in a huge park, so from the outside you don't see it at all. It's also just 3 stories high. And the interesting is also the development on this, because like Frank Gehry at the beginning was proposing like his usual kind of facade, strange kind of like building that is really kind of a symbol. But in the discussion with Facebook, they kind of like reduced it more and more, and it became really this kind of flat horizontal landscape, which is actually the building as a garden. And this is how offices actually look today. Yeah, they kind of are maybe more like living rooms. This is kind of where people today work. Maybe some of the elements, yeah, like a kicker, are more important or as important as meeting rooms maybe, because that's where people go for relaxing for a moment and actually having discussions about work. This is not a coffee place, but this is actually a workplace as well. And when we had the discussion before about technology, yeah, like Facebook and all these things, I don't think it makes us more lonely like we had before the discussion. I mean, it didn't happen like this, yeah, with new technology we didn't get separated our work, but actually the opposite is happening, that we can actually work anywhere. So actually this could be an office the same way like all the other places we saw. Actually we can work now in nature, it doesn't really matter, because we carry almost all our work, all the things that we need with us, around us. And if you look at the office scape, because that is something in Russia which I always experience, that there is like a lot of design in private places, there's a lot of retail design, there's a lot of design of restaurants and all this, but there's not so much thought and design about office places, yeah? And companies at the moment, they want to kind of get connected or kind of let the people be happy by paying higher salaries. And that is kind of a normal process that happens everywhere in the world. But it's a very interesting statistics here from the USA, where they compare the GDP per head, so the development, how much you earn, and the happiness factor. And you see that is kind of like, at the beginning it's true, the more you earn, the more happy you are. But then at one point here in the 1960s, something very funny happened, that the GDP started to rise, but the happiness factor actually stagnated or almost went down. Yeah? So there is provable a disconnect between like paying people more and more salary doesn't necessarily mean make them more and more happy. So people in work looking also for other things, not only money issues. And so if you think the kind of like that companies want to have happy employees, yeah, which is this one, because what Bruce was showing is less absenteeism, less burnout, less kind of like sick leave time of people, which for them leads obviously to more productivity and the company becomes more successful. It is part of like good physical space, yeah, and this is like what probably your numbers prove, that in the building where you create a kind of like more comfortable environment, more sustainable environment, actually that the people are more happy without actually earning more money constantly. But I want to start my story now again in somewhere in Russia, in the Ural, very close to Chelyabinsk. So it's a very small town, it's a monogorod called Satka. It has around 60,000 inhabitants. So we think about changing the people in this city, we're probably talking about changing kind of like how the work is as well, because every person basically works or is dependent on one company. So this is the city, probably not many of you heard about it, but we got to know it through a competition where we actually proposed to make, or we started the competition in producing a game in order to think how to let people participate in the design of it, in the design of a square. So that was like how we actually started the competition. We developed that game, and that was something very simple in order to bring really all the people in the city around one table and discuss with them what they want, what kind of design they want, what is their kind of imagination of a new square, of a new public design in the city. And we had this really interesting discussion, like people, because at the beginning, people were quite skeptical. They told us, no, in Russia, no one will do that. People are afraid to participate. They won't tell you anything. But after 5 minutes, the opposite happened. Everyone really wanted to say something, and everyone gave us some really value information about the square, what they want, how it should be developed. And actually, that made us kind of like keep on working in the city, because the company that is having, or is the biggest business in this city, has similar values. They pay a lot of attention on the people and kind of like develop a lot of things around them and for them. So that made us start a second thing, which were actually leaded then to the office that I want to show you, because they were thinking of rebranding all the industrial buildings. And we did a little project of like how that can be rebranded, so how there could be a strategy, like a process over time to kind of like look at existing buildings, look at new buildings, and how you can create kind of like a more lively or more kind of like happy working environment within this huge industrial site. And a part of this, since you saw the slides before, we believe like in the power of letting people being part of the design, was like proposing to let actually people design as well the buildings. Yeah, so not us coming as designers and tell them exactly where or how something should be done, but to use old buildings also that kind of like people can participate and they have the feeling that is kind of their factory, their buildings, and their design as well. And obviously the kind of like company is everywhere in the city. Yeah, it's like kind of part of the people's life, kind of almost in every aspect. And so, sorry. And so if you think about changing people, changing like how people think, we looked at the kind of approach with the company together. So we said, okay, maybe the best would be to build really a new headquarter for the administration in the town. And they agreed to build like a new headquarter for around 500 people, so 6,000 square meters. And the building should be part of a kind of like educational process on how to let people understand new ways of living and how to kind of like develop in a more sustainable way, because that was from the beginning also part of our discussion. And whenever there were people like kind of very skeptical if you can build really a sustainable or self-sustained office in Russia, we're always actually showing the Manitoba building, because we're always arguing with Thomas together, that's the same climate, and if you can do it in Canada, why can't you do it in Russia? And that was kind of actually, that building was actually quite important for us in order to kind of push the ideas. Yeah? And if you think about kind of like all these important issues of we worldwide have to save energy, we have to become more sustainable, take care of our environment, we didn't want to kind of like propose something where you say to people, hey, you have to save things or like tell them what to do, but we wanted to look at an approach which is more have to do with kind of like fun. Yeah? If you can give them another alternative, people ultimately over time they will understand that maybe this alternative is much better than what they have or what they're doing today. Just as a reference, I wanted to show the Volkswagen Fun Theory. That was a little competition in Sweden a couple of years ago. And the task was for several companies to let people understand sustainable thinking. And this is a project where people wanted to make people use less the escalator, but use the stairs more. But not by forbidding them, but just by doing a more fun alternative. So this is a situation now, is an exit from a metro and everyone uses the escalator. Yeah, so you see, it's like very easy to kind of like change the behavior of people, just give them a more fun alternative and people will ultimately use it. So that was the idea when we started to think about this new headquarter, this new kind of like building in the factory. So it shouldn't be like a palace like that you saw from the Chrysler building or others, which impress people when you enter, that lets people feel small, but should be something that is kind of like a building that is fun to use and fun for people to work in. Yeah, like you saw the pictures with yoga classes from Bruce and all this. So we set up a set of rules with the client, what really has to be done in the building in order to make it this kind of like fun approach. So one was the building should have maximum 3 stories, including the ground floor, so that people start using staircases and not elevators, because you know it from yourself, an elevator you never communicate. On a staircase you communicate when you meet people. Then there should be like open spaces that people can use, kind of atria. And there was like a whole set of a list that we agreed with the client what this building or what the performance of the building should be without having an exact brief. We didn't really know how many space they need. They just said roughly 400 to 500 people should fit into this building. So what we started, we didn't start with the outside shape, but we started to agree upon some images, some kind of atmospheres that this building should really feature. So that is part of our first presentation, where really we're just discussing about the kind of like interior world, the kind of like how people should feel and operate in this building. And this led us at the end, so once we agreed on that, that let us look at some program and how actually the outside should look like. And there was kind of this idea of having actually a box in a box building, so kind of like an environment out from the kind of like outside, and you have inside a landscape of buildings. But we found, or we discussed with the client, that we don't want this, we don't want to show this kind of like palace or something, we're really disconnected from the outside world. And then we started to kind of like work with slim kind of buildings, like almost like snakes, and looking at kind of atria that could happen in between the buildings. And then in some discussions, actually also with Thomas, we kind of figured out the most sustainable way actually to get like kind of also a very small footprint would be to build parallel building blocks and use the space in between as a kind of atrium. And actually, since the client not only wanted to have 2 offices, so that would be the best thing for an office, they also wanted to have a library for people that can be used and also a lecture hall. We needed kind of like a 3rd volume as well. And actually, we figured out that putting the program in, that the logo of the company is actually kind of like a perfect shape for this new building, and would actually fit the program ideally also with all the square meters. So from that, like we developed then actually the building from the logo, distributed the functions, changed a bit the distance that you can let more light in and have kind of like views into the factory, and closed the spaces in between as atrias for the people to use in winter time, in spring and autumn. And that was basically the design of the building. So and since we are in a huge factory site, so the building is kind of located here, the good thing was that we were free in the rotation of the building, because you're not kind of like in a city where it has to do with some kind of relationships with close by buildings. And I will show you later why that was kind of important in the, or what is important in the design there as well. And you see here we have this kind of like 2 kind of blocks with offices, and the kind of like triangle which has the library here, the meeting space here, and the library and little museum on the other floors. And so you enter the building here into one of the atria, and you have on this side, so you can also use this for external uses, so this could be used for cinema. The entrance to the library also works without entering the office. And then within the office, it's all open spaces. So we wanted to reduce the number of cabinets, which you see still couple, to a minimum. So there shouldn't be any kind of like little rooms where everyone has their kettle, makes their own tea, has their secrets and all this, and communication is very difficult. But we wanted really this open space, which as much communication as possible. And So if you enter the building here, you get into this main atrium, and as you said, kind of like hybrid things, that is kind of probably one of the strategies that is kind of like for future building or how to engage with people. This atrium can work as a kind of space for celebration, for the New Year's Praznik, stuff like this as well. And it can open directly to the auditorium as well. So you could actually, after a kind of like lecture there or kind of like a symposium, open it up and use this for an extension of that space. So almost like a lobby as a party space. You see here this kind of, so we have the normal fire staircases, but we have inside the atrias, we have this kind of more sculptural staircases, which are just the communication spaces. They're quite big and they're for people to meet. And the communication between the building part happens with these bridges where kind of people can stop by, talk with each other. The atria are important as well in a kind of like sustainable energy concept. So they work like in winter, we use them for sucking out the air from the offices. So the warm air is taken out here, and we regain the heat through a heat changer and pump in waste heat from the factory. So they kind of like become almost like air collectors for the waste air from the offices. And in summertime, they work like a chimney, so they heat up more than the office spaces, and they work like as natural ventilation for the office spaces that are surrounded. And what we started to do is like look at the kind of solar or passive solar gain of the atria spaces as well, because like as you saw in summer, they should heat up as much as possible in order to work as chimneys. Also in winter, you want to pump in as little energy as possible into them. So it's quite important how much gain from the sun you actually get on the surfaces and inside this atria. And we work with a simplified model. So you see this is one of the offices, this is a 2 atria. And we actually looked at different orientation and how much passive solar gains you get into this atria, and if it changes if you rotate the building a little bit. And we made all this comparison, and actually we figured out one of the positions, which is this one, where you have sustainable or substantial more heat gain from the sun just by the orientation of the building. So there's no like extra technology, it's like very low tech, it's just about the rotation of the building, and you kind of maximize the solar gains inside the spaces, which you then don't need to heat up. This is showing the second atria. You see again one of these staircases, and probably similar like in Bruce building, there will be yoga classes and other things organized by the employees, which can use this space for free because it's basically kind of like this hybrid space. Then another important thing is like the comfort of people. So every one of you knows this, when you're somewhere sitting for a long time, you always like to look outside. And it's not about looking outside, seeing other people, but scientists find out that people find themselves more comfortable when they see the sky. And the sky for us means it's not kind of an artificial light, which is always the same, but it's a changing light during the day. And kind of we as people that are from nature got really used to this. And studies showed that if people have the possibility to see the sky, they feel much more comfortable at work. And we had to close the atria. So the atria had to be closed by, or 70% of this has to be closed in these weather conditions in Russia, because if you would make it all glass, you would get just like too much heat loss, because you won't get the insulation into the glass. So then was the question, do we close the top or the middle part of the atria, or are we closing the sides? And probably the first intuitive approach would be to say, yeah, we of course close the sides, because then we get much more light into the atria and into the building. But then if you analyze the working spaces, so if you look at the 3 floors and you look at actually the people in red, they don't see the sky. So that is the kind of like sideline when you're sitting and working and you have no access to the light. So once you start actually opening up the sides and closing the middle, you get even people on the ground floor to have a direct connection to the sky and to the kind of like light. And this is actually the reason why these kind of atria are closed here and open up more to the center and then going down to the sides as well, because at the end you get anyways all the light from here, so you don't need any light from the top. So most of the geometry is kind of a reason for like people feeling more comfortable, or like kind of like a psychological reason how to increase the kind of like work comfort of the people. And maybe a similar thing to Winnipeg is as well, when we analyze the sun radiation, that actually you have a lot of sun gain in Satka. So it's something between Berlin and Stuttgart. And Stuttgart in Germany has the most sun hours in whole over Germany, and Satka somewhere in between. So it actually makes really sense to put photovoltaics, so solar batteries on the building. So in the kind of library and the conference hall where you don't need so much daylight into the building, we replaced some of the the big windows with solar panels in order to gain some extra energy. So, but it's only on this facade, and it's only because we could prove that actually, yes, it makes sense in a climate like in the Ural to use this kind of technology. And another thing is the client, actually at the beginning they wanted to have air conditioning. The office should be fully air conditioned. And then we asked them, okay, what is the reason? When do you need that? And they said, well, we have in summer really hot days. And so probably the peak here is almost the same like in Winnipeg. No, it looks very similar. So, but we found out that yes, there are some days here in summer where the temperature is rising over a certain level that you would need an air conditioning in order to cool the building. But when we looked at the peaks, and one of them is here in the middle of July, we figured out that actually the funny thing is that the temperature drops at night by around 10 degrees. So there's a really high difference between the day temperature and the night temperature in this location. And then we looked at all the other peaks, and whenever there was a peak, the same phenomena is happening, that the night temperature is dropping by more than 10 degrees. So we worked out with Thomas the system where actually we use the ceiling here, so we don't have kind of like a false ceiling, but the ceiling is exposed concrete in order to catch the heat at daytime. So when the offices get really hot in daytime, the heat is going up and it's like concrete, so it saves the energy, it cools down the office space, and at night we just open the windows and let this kind of concrete cool down for the next day, that it can start on a cooler temperature because we have this drop of 10 degrees. And by this we can save the air conditioning because we only needed the air conditioning for actually a couple of days in the year. So this system hopefully will kind of like work and we don't need to install the air conditioning at all. What that means for us is actually that you have to run all the cables and everything on the ground floor of the building, so we had to put the false floor, so that was the decision for this. And if you know that from buildings, the problem with the exposed concrete is that you will have very bad acoustics. That's why they put most of the time false ceiling, that you increase the acoustics, and especially in a kind of like open office where there's a lot of people all talking on the phone or with each other, that might be a problem. And the solution was to kind of put this kind of half circles in here. So if you and it's basic physics, so if you get the sound waves in, they all kind of like are collected in the center. In the center we have a little element with an acoustic absorber, so the sound is collected in the center and it kind of like quiets down the office with just covering a very little piece or very little percentage of the ceiling space. And at the same time, with new modern LED technologies, you can put a very small LED here, and if you use the same physical principle in the other direction, you get a very equal and nice lighting inside the office space. And yeah, just another impression of the building. It's we are working now on all the construction documents, and hopefully it will be open in the new year of 2015. We'll have this New Year celebration that you saw at the beginning, and will be for sure the first sustainable office in the Ural, and hopefully kind of like change the kind of way people think and behave in there, because that was basically the reason why we started this whole endeavor with our partners. So yeah, so that is a view. We see kind of the atria also working at night as kind of spaces that you can use even afterwards, because it's a small city. There's not a lot of bars or spaces, social spaces that people can use. So the company in this case can offer that spaces for the people, and they can program them. So they can either run yoga classes or they can make other things happening in this building. So that was my part, or my kind of like contribution to this discussion. Thanks a lot, and I think Thomas, you are.
Yeah, Daniel, thank you very much. I think it was very interesting, both talks. Bruce, you gonna come? I think, let's say, starting to talk about what a building can do for a city. I think we all think of Bilbao, it's everybody's dream to do a building which creates the Bilbao effect, so that the building is making a big change for a whole area, not only for the city, but for the whole area. The question we have to discuss today is whether the iconic building, whether, let's say, a sculptural building can achieve such an effect, or whether it shouldn't be more created by content. And let's say, since we don't have any discussion yet, I would really be happy if you could interact in the discussion. So if anybody has questions as we have this debate here, just raise your arm and we are happy to include you in the discussion. So like Daniel was talking about participation in the design process, let's talk about participation in a discussion, so that it's not just a front discussion. Okay, but let me start the first debate. The first question, I just concentrate on moderating this a little more than being involved in the projects. Maybe you just forget that I was involved in those projects. But the question for Daniel, like the one theme Bruce brought up was hybrid. And like, I think you included many good ideas in this building, and I also like the architecture expression. But how can the building interact more with the city? What can the building do to create a more lively city and draw people to the building, to the plaza, into the building, whatever? Have you ever talked to Magnesit about this?
Yeah, okay. So we had a lot of these discussions, what the spaces can be and what you can do there. And the funny thing is, like in Russia, the more east you go, I mean, like if you start to go to Ural or Siberia, there's a funny phenomena that bars, restaurant, everything have closed facades. So even if you have like here, if there would be like a restaurant here behind there, they would put a second facade behind the glass, and they are closed off. So I was always irritated when I went there, because even at daytime, when there's a nice sunny day, you go to a restaurant or a bar and you don't have any access to daylight. And it's kind of a strange thing, and it's changing slowly, but this really kind of this being connected to the beautiful nature, and there's a lot of sun, actually it's cold, but there's a lot of sun, is something that was maybe kind of still from kind of like thinking from the Soviet time, still part of the culture there. And in Satka, where you have probably 3 restaurants, that's all, or maybe 4 in the whole city, you don't have really this public spaces where you can have a coffee, where you can meet with people. And that was one of the reasons why we put on the ground floor this kind of big open cafeteria that can actually be used by people as kind of like, almost like a space like here, where you have really access to daylight in winter, where you can sit. And probably it's kind of a more comfortable space, because it feels very strange when you really go there and you don't have this kind of connection to the outside. Yeah.
But did Magnesit really agree to open this building up for the public? Like, are they engaged in this kind of idea?
Yes, I mean that's why it's whole started. I mean, that was part of the brief. The only thing is that it is in the factory site, so there are restrictions on security, but that's why we're having this discussion now, where exactly to place it. so that they can be accessed. And that's also why the library is in there. That's really for people from the city. So it's a library from the company, but it's actually a public, or is accessible by the public, and people should come there and be drawn into the building.
We just had this discussion, like I was invited to be part of a workshop at Audi. And Audi also, as a big global player, as a manufacturer, thinks about what's the appearance, what's the customer experience as they approach Audi. And the first thing we said to them is get rid of your fence, because the whole factory is fenced. And open it up. But what was interesting, they started and come, as the first impression is, they want to use architecture to, let's say, change their face to the city, to the world. They want to use architecture, but they don't want to have an architecture zoo. This is what they said. Like the biggest example in Europe, I think, is the Novartis campus in Basel, where we also worked on a couple of buildings, but it's fenced off. You need to have a guiding tour, and it's an architecture zoo. And I said, no, this should be about content. It's not about the sculptural buildings, it's about content. And I think, Bruce, in all of your buildings, it's all about this. It's like you not try to create a sculpture building, even though they become sculpture, but it's about the interaction, and it's about the content of how they can interact with the city, isn't it?
I don't know if this is on, but I think even, I don't know how large this institute is, but I think if you really look at it, it's doing a lot in terms of animation of the ground plane. You know, before I always used to think it was really about the form of the building and maybe, I'd say, the lower 5 or 6 floors of the building. But now I actually think, you know, I've been in practice for a long time. I think the greatest challenge is to animate the ground plane. And very few architects think about that much. Especially in my city, where there are lots of new condominium towers. I think in the world right now, Toronto has the highest number of construction cranes for constructing high-rise residential. But if you look at them and you evaluated the buildings about how they manage the ground floor and how they manage the openness and the accessibility and the capacity of buildings to actually bring people together, they would all fail, all of them. You've seen them. I mean, they're terrible. And I think it's actually because people just don't think about it. All I'm saying is it's really time to think harder about it, because I think it makes successful cities. Ground plane animation is what you experience most often. I remember looking for the Chrysler Tower, and I walked right by it because I didn't see the top of the building. And it's very dead at the ground floor if you've been there. And I've also climbed up into the top of the Chrysler Tower. That's an amazing thing. It just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. But what we're talking about is cities. And for Jane Jacobs, it was the public realm and the things that we have as our shared common ground, which is what we're in. I mean, even this is remarkable because it shows that even in this kind of climate, you can modify it just enough to make it comfortable. Like I was actually starting to get very warm because I was sitting right under the heater. But I think it works. And we were talking earlier too about more people are thinking about how exterior space is being used. Maybe you're already well ahead of that. You already think that the urban landscape and the spaces that we actually share come first. And it doesn't mean that your building isn't going to be beautiful or iconic. It just means that when you take all of the design criteria, that you've thought very hard about everything. And I see a lot of buildings that get published by very good designers where the objective is something else. And I think that we're not in a time when we can just have a limited agenda anymore. It's about integrating all of that knowledge that you have from all the different disciplines and really doing something that makes a real difference and is very possible. So, you know, I'm pretty optimistic because I think that you know, we have a lot of young people working in our office, and they really get it. They understand, you know, yeah, they love Facebook too, but they also get the idea that without real-time interaction, you wouldn't have a school. One of the things that happened is I went to California, and I went to look at Pixar. I went to Google's campus, and I went to Facebook before Frank Gehry. And what they told me was at Facebook that the company that had been there before was Sun Systems. And they just bought their existing buildings. And they said Sun Systems made the biggest mistake by telling their employees they could work from home. They completely destroyed the culture of the whole company. And there are other reasons, but they went out. And Facebook, even though you're in the midst of the biggest suburban state in the world, California, all of their efforts to work with Frank Gehry is to actually send him back to where he began, because the early Frank Gehry work in California is very interesting. It's like this. It's actually more like this building. Low rise, not iconic, very focused on sort of smaller spaces and real interaction, but still being really well designed. So to me, it's really interesting that Facebook hired him and then told him, don't give us Bilbao. Give us something that actually builds community. So for Daniel, I think, the challenge is it's a company town where a lot of people are going to be there, but how do you make something that really benefits the entire community? And I think what Thomas is saying is maybe there needs to be another component brought into the project that would kind of tip the balance in the times when the building isn't open just for their employees. It could be very, very small. Like, I think this restaurant is doing a lot of work, because it draws audiences in, and just before you go in, you hear the noise in here, and it works incredibly well. And so sometimes it's just one move, and it's a planning move. It's not a design move. It's a design strategy. Then you do the design.
Like we worked with young Gail from Copenhagen. I'm not sure if you guys know young Gail. He's an architect who specialized on the livable city. He's consulting cities all over the world on the question, what makes a city livable? He was working with New York City on about the Times Square pedestrian zone, and he always states that it's basically two indicators which shows a livable city. The one is, how many people do you find in the public realm? And the second, how many people do you find on a bike? So if these are the two indicators for a livable city, how important are buildings, or let's say, how important is the design of the building? And like the reverse, if I look at Dubai, where all the great architects worked, our architects really understand the fundamentals of their work? I think that's the thing we need to question. Many good architects. Yeah.
I mean, I think for this you also have to understand a bit kind of how the people in the city, especially in the city where you build, kind of think and behave. And what was really striking because we worked 3 years already in the city, and one of the people that work on this project now with us, he's actually from the city, but then lived in London, so in kind of like other cities as well. And I asked him the question, so why there's so little restaurants, and why there's no bar where you can go in the evening in this little town? And he said, well, the friends of him tried to open something, but every one of them was facing the problem whenever they opened something, there was some kind of like guys coming, like almost like hooligans, like kind of trying to break things and all this, and they had to close after a certain time. And he said the only possibility actually to do something there would be to use kind of like a big company like that under their kind of umbrella to really propose a public space. So I think, there is some kind of like psychology or some problems in this kind of towns, that when you come from a city like maybe Stuttgart or Toronto, you really can't like kind of like expect or something, and really in this kind of like discourse with the people, you can find things that might work. And the interesting thing is that what we figured out, that with clients in Russia, the good and the bad thing at the same time is that they're absolutely not organized like European or maybe Canadian clients, because when they come with a brief, they don't give you like a big kind of like book where they say, okay, we need that many spaces, and they define everything, but they come, they say, okay, we want a new office. And you say, yeah, but how much space you want? So we don't know. We like around 500 people.
That's why they hire an architect.
Yeah, but the good thing is that, you know, once you get a really specific brief, I think what you do as an architect, you start to think about the icon. Once you don't get that, you have to really think more about the programming as well, and like from the beginning. And I think that is a big opportunity. I mean, at the beginning it seems like a problem because it is additional work that you're not normally doing when you get the brief, but it helps you maybe to develop the building from a complete different way. And we developed it more like from user stories. We thought, okay, what are the people? Who is the person that goes to the library? Who is it? What they want to do? And with this conversation with the user stories, we kind of like develop the brief at the end with the client.
But in terms of design, coming back, like Bruce, you said about the ballet school, you put it into the middle ground. It's not in the foreground. It's not in the background is the condo tower. But do we need to put buildings more in the middle ground so that the foreground is more the public realm, the interaction with the people?
Well, I think the building, when the dancers come to the facade, they're in the foreground, and at night they're in the foreground. In the day, they're set back, but we knew that the two towers were coming, and they were relatively high, and also the area for the school was decreased when the deal was cut for the real estate for the private sector. So we had to stack. And it just became a middle ground because originally there was a master plan for an all low-rise campus, and that just wasn't going to happen. So, I mean, I did one thing that I think was really good, which was in the master plan, they had, you know, between the two heritage buildings, they had a much taller building, and what I proposed was to move the studios from there to the far north end of the scheme so that that tower would come up into the middle ground. And I think it is a big difference because it opened the scheme to the lake and to the rest of the city to the south. But people don't think about, like, even saying foreground, middle ground, background seems like such an old idea, like an art historical idea. But the reality is it works and it oscillates. That's my point, that it's not always, because some people come just to look at our studios. There are people from all over the world coming to look at the dance school because it's really big. And because the facilities are really great, they're able to do programming where they draw young dancers from all over the world to Toronto. And they choreograph each other's companies with new work. It's an amazing thing. But without that building, there's no possibility because it's just not going to happen in Toronto. There's no reason to come. But so part of it, you know, with all this other stuff, sustainability, blah, blah, the reality is when you make something, you have to make something where the facility itself is really incredible. It's really, really the best. We looked at all the other dance schools. We went to Paris, we went to London, and we went to Seattle, to the Ballet of the Pacific Northwest. I should have come here. This is where the great dancers are. But it's all changed now. The paradigm has changed in the dance world where it's much more about, I think, the individual and no longer the kind of sort of basic cookie cutter classical dancer anymore. I think all of that is gone, and I think people are now thinking more holistically and in a much better way about dance as being something that everyone should enjoy, and it's really about your lifestyle. That's a big aspect of the sustainability of dance because most dancers had anorexia or bulimia. I mean, there's serious health issues in the world of dance. And the building is just one part of the whole thing. But that building in our country has won all the awards because of architecture as foreground. It's won awards for heritage because those are very important, even though they're 19th century buildings are very, very important, but it also won for urbanism in terms of development of the residential, and that's when it's a really great award. I thought that was maybe the most important award that we won because an international jury said that project is really demonstrating all those principles of mixing and the hybridization, joint use of land, thinking about everything. It's not just in categorical, I mean, I presented categorically, but the reality is it's not like that. I just did that to make a presentation.
I mean, let me maybe understand your question differently. Yeah. So you asked, do we need more buildings in the middle ground? Yeah. So maybe let's ask into the audience, who of you was born actually in Moscow? Can you raise your hand up? So I would say maybe like 20%, 15%?
No, 30, 40.
Okay, whose both parents were born in Moscow of you? Yes, so I think
whose grandparents were?
So I think if you ask about the middle ground, I would also understand. You know, do we need more buildings? Good buildings and increasing quality of life in cities that are not the capitals, because obviously a big problem of Moscow is that it draws so many people in here, like all of you or your parents came here for a reason, yeah? And I think today what you see with kind of technology, some of these reasons might be obsolete, other reasons are still there. And if you quoted Richard Florida, one of his main arguments is that before people came to where the companies are, where work is. Today something very different happens. Companies come to where the good people are. That's what we see now in Berlin, that actually Berlin was a city that never had, or like since a long time didn't have big industries. But now suddenly all the kind of IT companies and startups, they're moving there, and a lot of companies now are drawn in because there's the creative people, the good people. And a big problem of Russia is that they will lose, or like Russia will lose 1/3 of the population by 2050. As dramatic as Japan. But Japan is that small compared to Russia, that big. So, but all the industries, all the business is actually not in Moscow. I mean, yes, here's a financial hub and here's the money made, but it will not survive without agriculture, without industries and all this. And if you're not able to increase the quality of life of people there, something very dramatic will happen, because like the whole thing will collapse, because it's the biggest country in the world, basically. And I think that is what we really have to think, and maybe Winnipeg is a good example for this as well. It's not a capital, it's not the main town. And yes, I think companies and cities have to be like willing enough and have to take the challenge to invest there, not only in the capital.
Yeah. No, yeah, absolutely agree. Even though I think all of the discussions also apply to capital cities. It also applies to cities like Moscow, like Toronto, like Paris, like London. Because I think it's about the quality of life and the quality of the area. And I think the question I asked about the middle ground, I think there's one thing I remember is about New Orleans. There was this statistic that showed that in the 20s, none of the buildings had air conditioning, and New Orleans is a tropical climate, it's super humid and hot, and all the people basically lived on their porch and viewed the public realm. So there were always
These are the people that if you open a place in South Carolina, come.
Yeah. So there were always people in the public realm, and the public realm was observed. And as people got air conditioning, more and more they moved inside. And as more people had air conditioning, the crime rate increased. So the city was safe as people were in the public realm and observed the public realm. So putting the people and the public realm onto the foreground, and then bringing sustainability into the game, because I think there's also an importance in terms of sustainability, because sustainability, when we worked on Winnipeg, sustainability was, or let's say climate responsive design, was not about indoors only. We did wind studies, we did sun studies to maximize the environmental quality in the public realm as well. So I think it's, if we put more emphasis, I think the question is, if we put more emphasis on the public realm and people in the public realm, the building per se somehow moves into the middle ground, but might become more important at the same time, and therefore might become also iconic by what it does to the city than by let's say, kind of whatever shaped design. Like it's getting an icon by function and not by the fact that it's a big perfume bottle.
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, I agree that when we were doing Manitoba Hydro, I think we talked about, they said they wanted a signature architecture, and I said that, the building would, and this is when we were still applying to get selected, and we were competing against major architects who had done major sustainable buildings, that we said that our approach to signature would be that it would be distributed throughout everything. We said we'd make great space throughout the whole building, that everything you touch and you see would be part of this process, and that you would see the sustainable components, the key components like the atriums and the interconnecting stairs and the solar chimney, they would evolve and become the signature of the project. It wouldn't be because it's a pyramid or because it's a single shape, that it's more complex than that, that people would recognize and appreciate the form of the building once they understood it, that it would take time. And I don't think you can declare your own building to be an icon. I don't think that's a real possibility. I think, it's other people, the public, that'll decide what your building really is. But there is a signature, and it's about language, it's about architectural language, it's about how you make something coherent and how you integrate the parts. For me, the more iconic parts of hydro are not the whole building, but the solar chimney or the water feature, I think, is really quite amazing, because it's the fusion of performance and aesthetics. It makes noise, it's beautiful to look at, but is that an icon? Does it matter? I think that what matters to me most is that we keep track of that building on a daily basis, pretty much. They're really studying that building because, it's a major undertaking. And so we have a whole country that, with a lot of engineers and architects who are watching our building very, very closely. And what matters to me most is that the feedback we get from hydro and from people who've worked in the building, that it's a different kind of building, that the air quality is sensational, it's amazing. Most people in the workplace or here, probably a third of you have respiratory issues, asthma or lung issues, breathing issues. And in our building, for those people who constitute a big part of the workforce, they think that hydro is one of the only comfortable buildings in the entire city to work in. And we've done some other buildings since that have this quality, but you're constantly getting fresh air and light. And those are the two basic ideas of modernism, air and light. They were really the driving forces of progressive modernism. And I think that building, I'm glad to come here with that building, because I think that building builds on a tradition of modern architecture, but actually delivers, because a lot of my problem with modern architecture, it often didn't deliver. It didn't actually produce the sustainable environment that it was declaring it was out to achieve.
But I think that's very interesting what you're saying. I think what you should do, kind of like, publish this kind of data, what is changing the society, what is it changing the building, because who of you knew this building before the lecture was announced by Strelka? Who knew the Manitoba Hydro building in Winnipeg?
Well, you have to come to Winnipeg. Next.
Who knew the Guggenheim Museum? Also no one. Yeah, a bit more. So I think the problem is also, that it's really easy to kind of publish an icon or show that. It's really difficult to show your building. But if you really think about like issues like that, people at the moment are not thinking, like air quality. I was like last week I was at the TED lecture in Berlin, and there was one guy talking about air quality and pollution. And he had these numbers that actually in the US, asthma-related issues that are caused by pollution are costing the US more than all the wars that they did in the last years. Yeah, it's a kind of a big amount of money that this costs, these health issues. And looking at Moscow, it's like with all the kind of traffic here, there's also a lot of pollution going on. And the thing is like, how can actually buildings improve the quality of people? Because if I work for a company, a good company, I would assume they do the best for me that I have good air quality inside. But most of the buildings in the world, the air quality inside the building is 5 times worse than outside. So how all these issues, I think that is very important to kind of like talk about with kind of like people, clients, students, other architects and all that. And that's maybe part of your job as well, you know, that you're dealing with things that are actually not iconic, or how these parts can become iconic or like talkable.
True, yeah. Even though I think for us it's always important, most important, the integration of these things. And again, I want to really encourage you to engage in the discussion. Does anybody has a question? Yeah.
Hello. Hello. Thank you very much. And I have a question to Bruce. All the buildings that are you showing us are in a regular construction city, and I think that a lot of architects, I agree with you. And for example, if we want to create something like very circulation building and attractive and connection in Moscow, so we wouldn't have a free space in center, and in Moscow almost every public spaces and public much of public spaces are in center, and it's a problem about constructions of our city. It's a radial, and if we want to create something like this, we need to move part of this public life outside of center. So should we move this public life outside of center if we have a city like Moscow?
I mean, I don't know Moscow that much. It's the first time I've been here, but it's the center is really, really impressive and really kind of. I was telling Thomas, it's much better than anything I had imagined. You know, like we were walking on Red Square, and there were buildings that are icons. Every one. I mean, there are more icons in Russia, but they're heritage icons. But it does raise the question that you're asking, I think, which is, you know, the rest of the city beyond the center. I think it's interesting. I heard in the planning in Paris for public transit beyond the heart of Paris, and a huge investment, billions and billions of dollars in investing in public access, new subways, and hopefully great new public space beyond Paris. Because even though Paris is one of my favorite cities, once you go beyond that center, it's just like Toronto. It's like it could be anywhere. And I think that this city is huge. This is a huge city, and it needs to have some distribution and an idea. Our problem is we're trying to renovate all that suburban land in Toronto. It's massive amounts of land. You saw that video. I mean, that's the challenge of our time, because there are people living there who went there. All of that suburban land was developed with great optimism that it was a better life, and people were living on large lots. It's horrible. Go out there and check it out. And it has very little public space. So I think there has to be a rethinking. I mean, that's where the project that Daniel's working on, you know, it's not all about Moscow, it's about other cities as well. That's why Winnipeg is important to me. Like, I always look at city projects that are not on the main line, because I think sometimes you can achieve more there. And I don't know the perimeter of the city though, but I bet you it's going to be the same everywhere. I don't know any city that has taken an initiative to balance out the quality of life, services, everything, open space beyond the historic core. So all these images of cities we have are all based on the heart of the city, and they have nothing to do with the whole city.
Just to add to this, I also don't know Moscow well enough. It's the third time I'm here, but I still don't know it well enough. It's always coming in, coming out, going out. But what I always immediately recognize is the size of the streets, which are much bigger than in all big cities I've been so far. And I just want to give you a quote from Audi, a car manufacturer. They say they have every other year, they have this Audi Urban Design Award, and they say the car shaped our cities in the 20th century. The 21st century, the city will shape the car. Means the city will change mobility. And I think we shouldn't put too much emphasis on car infrastructure and reuse car infrastructure for other purposes and put the emphasis on other means of transportation. I think that might be a potential for Moscow. Can you hand over the microphone? Just hand it over.
Hello. I would like to start my question with an example. If boss of an average Russian company will ask employees of his company if they want to work in a new office with a good environment, with a good climate and big amount of daylight, or they will choose not to move to a new office but to get all this money that can be spent on new office and get like additional salary. I think more than 60% of people will choose some additional salary instead of working in a good environment. And my question is, how can we change people's mind in Russia to make them think that sustainable buildings are better for the whole country?
I mean, I would like to answer with another example. There's a startup company in the US, which is quite big, from Silicon Valley as well. And they pay an employee, after he was working for 2 months, 3 times the salary if they're leaving. So if you decide to leave today, you get 3 times your salary without any, you don't need to do anything. They just give people they offer them a lot of money to go away. Because they think we only want people that are really dedicated to this company and who really want to work here and are proud of this company. So I think the issue that you're saying, you know, I think a part of this is also a problem of the companies. Maybe the companies are not interesting enough for the people to work, because if this person would get offered more money in another company, they would probably also leave. So I think the thing is that also all companies have to see how far they can bind people to their kind of like company, because that is kind of one of the biggest issues we will face in the future, that people need really good human power, you know, really good kind of like innovative, creative people. And that is one of the biggest challenges everywhere in the world. I mean, in Germany, companies like Daimler, yeah, which is one of quite big brand, Mercedes, they spend money on advertisement for new people. It's something completely new. Like 5 years ago, these companies, when they said, okay, we're looking for a new person, they had hundreds and hundreds of applications. Today, if they open up an application, there's people coming there and they're asking, okay, what will I get here? Why should I start in your company? So like there's less workforce than actually, or good workforce than kind of like companies that need the good workforce. So there's kind of like a really kind of tipping point at the moment within our whole network. And this, I think, where Florida also is talking about that now suddenly people prefer quality of life. They go to a city like Berlin, where actually there's not much jobs, but they have a good life, instead of going to a shitty city where there's a lot of companies. Like in Stuttgart, there's a lot of big
people want to move to Stuttgart still. No, but let me give you another example to answer it. I think at Hydro is a really good example, because they had all their facilities in the suburbs and people were used to drive with their car to work. Everybody, 90% of all people came with their own car to work. And when they moved this building downtown and had no parking for staff, there was literally no parking for staff. A lot of people hated this. Most people at Hydro hated this building for this reason, for this very simple reason. And Hydro themselves, like the manager of the building, he told us that at one point, after people had been there for half a year or a year, they had some space issues. And they went to one department and said, you have to go back to the suburb facility because we need the space here for another department. And they protested. They said, we not want to go back to the shitty building in the suburbs. And I said, no way. And since then, he said, there are no more complaints. So I think this might be a good point at the end to say, like, to how far can we really get with participation? Because sometimes, and I think that's sometimes the beauty of a company, it's not always a democratic structure, but it's a CEO or a board of a company has to decide what's the best for the company. And interaction and productive people and motivated people are the most important capital for a company. And so they have to decide whether their environment for the people might be more motivating than the salary. So this is a decision they have to make. And just to give you another number to support this, the staff of the building is about, or let's say if energy is $1 a square foot, then the building is $10 per square foot over its lifetime, but the staff working in this building is $100 per square foot. So the capital of a company is not the building, it's not the energy, it's the staff. So if they are getting 2 or 3, 4% more productive, you can give them a better environment and more salary.
I mean, you can think about this with cities as well. You know, like the old mayor of Moscow. What did he do? He was always to get re-elected. He gave more pension to the old people here, right? There was before every election, the pension was little increased. So there was a lot of money spent. Now, what's happening now? The new mayor decided to build a park here, Zaradia Park, which is actually crazy because that is one of the most expensive land plots in the city, right? You might think that's really stupid to build a park there. But actually, if you think, you know, how many people will get more happy if you have a park in the city, at the end it's for like the city, or let's say that would be a company, much cheaper to spend that money than increasing the or the kind of like the pension of all the old people, you know? So these strategies exist, like either it's a city or a company, you know. Of course, there's always the try to make people happy with money, but it only gets you to a certain point, yeah? You will not be successful always with the strategy, and the old mayor is not here anymore, so it's like he wasn't very successful with the strategy either.
Thank you. That was the answer that I was looking for.
Okay, good. Bruce, you want to add something?
No, I think it's always a balance. People sort out their decisions. I mean, the thing with Winnipeg is it's got a very low cost of living compared to any other major city, and a lot of people who choose to live in Winnipeg think that it's the best kept secret in the country. And now we know, because they have a very strong, there are other factors, they have a very strong cultural scene in Winnipeg, more proportionately. It's like the Richard Florida statistics. Winnipeg actually has a university, has a very strong art scene, a music scene, and it's central, so you can travel from there everywhere else in North America. But the overall quality of life, especially for families, is very, very good. And so they balance that out with being in the building, because we get emails from people that we've never met thanking us for the building. They say, I've never worked in an environment like this. This is really unbelievable. You know, I feel better. Well, that's great. You know, I don't even know who they are, but I think that's the kind of feedback that we've been getting on it. And I think it's a total picture. I think people, you know, if you asked anybody, I think there was a survey recently where they asked everybody at different income levels, and everybody wanted 15% more. No matter what you made, you still wanted more. It's human nature, right? But it's also human nature, I think, to look at the whole picture and to try to create a life, a meaningful and life of well-being for yourself. I mean, that's, you know, when you're young, you just want to be successful and rich. But the reality is, you're not young forever, and you begin to think of the longer term, and that's sustainability. And you look at your own. You know, would you rather work, like I could rephrase your question, would you rather work in a terrible building, that's what, you know, and just make 15% more? But most of the enlightened companies that are leading, I think, leading companies, at least in North America, are all companies who've taken on the question of sustainability in some way. They're more enlightened. And as I was saying with the Deloitte survey, they found that their youngest people, and we find that with our youngest people, that they're interested in the environment. Maybe the politicians think it's falling down the agenda, and they don't need to focus on it because, you know, they want to get reelected on the economy. But the reality is most young people that I know who are smart, they're thinking about it. And it's actually in your hands. I mean, you know, you're going to determine the future. You've got huge amount of opportunity, I think, here. And I totally agree with Thomas. Like you've got the monumental scale of these great buildings and big spaces. It's incredible. But then, like I was talking about signature across every scale of architecture and landscape, I think Moscow needs to have a signature across every scale of neighborhood, public park, not just big parks, small parks. That was what Jane Jacobs taught about a healthy, livable city. She's considered to be old-fashioned, but a lot of things that are old-fashioned actually have renewed relevance. They just need to have a new expression. And I think that's the time we're in right now, where everything that I thought was old is new again. Like even the things that Daniel's a really hip guy and he's got a good building going on, but a lot of these things that he was saying were so fundamental and so basic to me that it's kind of rethinking, reinventing. It's not just trashing things. It is about renewal of urban fabric. I mean, that's the problem of China. I think the problem of China is that it's gone through such a radical growth spurt. It can't recognize itself anymore. We saw a great presentation in Munich about how to think about developing in the agricultural zone. The basic argument was that they'll run out of food production. And so they had to be very careful about urbanization in China, because this architect, who is the head of the leading school, said that if China has a problem with feeding itself, the world has a problem with feeding itself. And I'd say with Moscow, if Moscow can't figure out its urban quality and its future, there's a big problem. It's a big problem. It's not just Moscow. You have a chance to demonstrate something that's different than the way things would go without your intervention.
But Bruce, I think that's a good way to rephrase your question, because you're an architect or engineer.
Good.
So what is your most favorite engineering company in the world?
Despite Transsolar.
I'm not sure in which field of engineering.
Yeah, but where you are, I don't know. What engineer are you?
Actually, I have a degree of developing of computer-aided design programs.
Okay.
But I'm interested in sustainable architecture and especially in daylight in buildings.
Okay. So
I like the company Velux from Denmark, I think.
Okay, but you're an IT specialist, right? Or no, but
I'm an engineer.
Okay, but the question would be the following. You know, if you could work for like you said, a boring company here in Moscow, which does really strange things, you know, and you get 20% more, or you could work for a really cool company,
of
but
course
gets 20% less.
I will work for a very cool company because I think I spend like 1/3 of my life in the office, so it's like spending your time in a bad environment. It's my health, and I will prefer to be to work in a good place.
Okay.
So probably it's like a generation issue, no? So probably if you would really ask people from your generation your question, they would choose to work for a cooler company but earning less money than for the boring company and get more.
I think it's kind of generation problem, but it's a problem. For example, old people, older than maybe 60, they have children, and these children of these people who work in these kind of companies with a better environment, they can't show to their children a good environment in companies. It's like I can't remember the word when parents can't show better living for their children?
I think it's probably a problem that too many companies don't really understand the importance of this balance. Yeah. But as Bruce said, and I think this was a really good statement towards the end, you have the opportunity, like you are the young generation, you have the opportunity, and I'm very optimistic that things are going to change. So I thank you very much all for coming, and thank you for staying so long, again, despite the weather. And also, I want to thank Strelka for making this happen here. So thank you very much.